The day the river rose, Myra counted the cracks in the kitchen tiles and realized there were more lines on the floor than words between her and her husband. The storm made the small town smell like wet iron and pine, a metallic perfume that tugged at memories of summers that used to be softer, before silence learned the shape of their house. She pressed her palm to the cool porcelain and let the rhythm of water in the gutters answer the question she wouldn't ask out loud. How does a life come undone without a sound? Adrian stood by the window, winding the cord of the blind around his finger, slow and tight, like he was trying to bind daylight into obedience. He had a good face for steadiness, square jaw, calm eyes, the kind of expression that promised a plan even when promises felt extravagant. He was the sort of man who showed love by fixing a leaky tap at midnight and memorizing the dates of dental cleanings. A man of rituals and well-stacked calendars who never forgot to take the trash out, even when he routinely forgot why Myra loved jasmine tea. She watched him and thought, he has become a list of admirable things. She wondered when admiration replaced awe. On the mantel sat the ceramic heron they'd bought when dreams were cheaper, its blue glaze cracked like a river map. It was a joke then, our sentinel, but now it watched their domestic theater as faithfully as any parishioner. Myra rehearsed words in her mouth that felt both treasonous and true. I am lonely. She had been lonely for so long that loneliness had learned to dress politely and knock before entering. She let it in because it was the most honest guest their marriage could still bear. The storm drove the neighbors indoors, sent the park swings clanging like distant bells. That afternoon, Myra walked to the community center to check on the students from her adult literature class. 8 souls who came on Tuesdays to remember language had lived. She taught under fluorescent lights that hummed like insects, coaxing metaphors out of weary mouths until someone surprised themselves and laughed with their whole face. Teaching had become a shoreline. The tide of her life hit it and returned changed. He was there, as he had been for the past 3 months, sitting 3 seats from the back, notebook open, pen cradled lightly like something living. Levi wore a wool coat too warm for the season, the collar softened by years of reaching hands. He had a careful way of listening, body angled as if catching a radio broadcast others couldn't hear. When he read aloud, his voice carried the gravel of old roads and the warmth of a bar at midnight. He was 10 years younger than Myra, maybe 12. She told herself she didn't know because it didn't matter. It mattered. Write about a place you return to even when you swear you won't, she told them, and the room fell into the good silence of paper. Words make a sound when they land, soft, secretive, and she knew the moment his began. When he stood to share, the room reorganized itself around the gravity of it. Levi read about a rusted footbridge over a creek that smelled like copper and moss, about counting breaths on the planks because the water made him reckless. He said the footbridge taught him courage was a rhythm, not a roar. Myra felt something in her chest step onto a plank and test the weight. After class, a leak in the hallway released the storm into the building with a chorus of grim patience. Levi lingered, stalling by reading the bulletin board notices about potlucks past. Your prompt, he said, tapping his notebook, made me write something I didn't know I remembered. His eyes had that bright ruin of recognition, the look people get when they realize their own voice can find them. She smiled, trying not to move anything inside that might spill. That's the trick. Memory likes to hide under obvious things. He nodded, and then he said the sentence that would be a hinge she'd hear squeak open for months after. What would you write if you weren't afraid of who would read it? The hallway brightened, a fluorescent twitch, and in that half-stutter of light, she saw a version of herself sliding a letter into a mailbox she had no address for. She didn't answer, he didn't press. The leak plinked into a metal bucket like a metronome for bad decisions. At home, Adrian had made stew. He had chopped carrots into coins, the kitchen smelling of thyme and damp wool. He told her about the coworker who misfiled an invoice. She told him the river was nearly out of its banks. They ate carefully, as if the wrong bite might break a tooth. When he reached for her hand across the table, his fingers were warm, reliable, familiar like the weight of a well-worn sweater. She folded her hand into his and tried to force longing into gratitude the way one might force a cactus to bloom indoors. That night, rain drilled the roof like it was practicing an argument. Myra lay awake and thought about footbridges and rhythm, and how sometimes the bravest thing is not to step forward, but to admit the ground beneath is rotten. She turned to Adrian and watched him sleep, mouth slightly open, a soundless softness in his face that reminded her of the young man who once learned her favorite poem by heart and recited it at a bus stop. She loved that man. She loved this one too, the way one loves a ruin, both for what it was and what it stubbornly remains. Love is not a house, it's a weather system. She closed her eyes and tried to forecast herself. In the morning, the river had climbed into the streets like a tired animal seeking the warmth of porches. The town gathered in boots and bright raincoats to fill sandbags, the kind of communal urgency that both frightens and baptizes. Myra showed up before sunrise, hair crammed under a knit cap, palms raw by noon. When a pallet slipped and a bag split, Levi was there beside her, hands in the grit, laughing when the sand puffed into a cloud like a conjurer's trick gone wrong. "I thought about your question," he said, hefting another bag. "I would write about the day my mother left and the way oranges tasted too bright for months after. They built a wall together. It wasn't enough. Water is a patient tyrant. Still, the act of lifting and passing formed an intimacy that required no confession. At midday, the sky opened a vein of pale light, and someone cheered. They ate dry cookies from a Tupperware older than some of the volunteers. When a gust of wind knocked his cap askew, she reached to right it and found herself touching the soft spot just above his ear, where hair thins first in men who think they're still invincible. He looked up like he'd been called by his name in a dream. That evening, Myra drove home with grit in her teeth and a hummingbird trapped in her chest. In the shower, she watched muddy water swirl around the drain like a timid cyclone and thought of all the small whirlpools it takes to carve a canyon. Adrian knocked on the bathroom door, asked if she wanted tea. She said yes, grateful and guilty in equal measure. Guilt is a ladder. It leads everywhere you don't want to go, and you climb it because the other option is to admit you are already on the roof. When she dried off and caught herself in the mirror, she saw someone's mother, someone's wife, and a woman who had not been asked in years what she would write if she weren't afraid. All of these could be true, she told herself. But she also knew. The truth multiplies when you don't look at it directly. The night was clearer after the storm. She opened the bedroom window and let the smell of flattened grass creep in. Somewhere a dog barked twice, exactly, like a code she didn't know how to decipher. In bed, Adrian traced circles on her shoulder with the absent-minded devotion of a monk tidying a shrine. She turned into him and let their bodies remember the choreography they had invented together, a dance grown quiet and deliberate, still capable of ache. After, he slept, and she lay awake counting the seconds between lightning and thunder, even though the storm had passed. It took a long time to admit that the thunder was inside her. By dawn, the river had retreated in clumsy apologies, leaving the town draped with ribbons of debris that glittered like accidental tinsel. Myra brewed tea and held the mug until her palms hurt. She pulled a notebook from the drawer where she kept things that made her braver, uncapped a pen, and wrote, without lifting the nib. "I would write about the first time someone looked at me like I was still becoming." She didn't sign it. She didn't have to. A footbridge appeared in the margin, sketched in shaky lines. She drew a woman stepping onto it. She gave the woman a raincoat. She did not give her an umbrella. Spring made a late entrance that year, first with a stubborn crocus that dared the frost, then with the street trees shedding yellow dust that turned car hoods into premonitions. The community center's fluorescent hum softened into a brighter steadiness, and with it, Myra's class swelled with people newly curious about their own sentences. The bulletin board bloomed with thank you notes and flyers for beginner ukulele. Someone left a basket of Mayer lemons on the table by the door like an apology for winter. Levi stopped sitting 3 seats from the back. He took the chair by the window, where light battered the glass at 5 p.m., and began arriving early enough to carry boxes of old paperbacks from the storage closet. He wore that coat less, whether because the weather turned or because he needed its armor less, she didn't know. He wrote like a runner who trusts the dark path because his feet remember it. At break, he asked questions that climbed scaffolds into places Myra had boarded over. What made you become a teacher? When did you first feel unseen? If you could name a color after a feeling, which feeling would be green? She answered some. She let others hang in the air like mobile sculptures, beautiful and inconvenient. She learned he tended bar 3 nights a week at the Feather, the only place in town where the floorboards remembered jazz. He drew portraits on napkins for patrons and traded them for stories. He once hitchhiked to the coast to watch a meteor shower from a lifeguard chair. He had a sister who called him by his middle name when she was worried, which made worry sound like a lullaby. He did not volunteer the scar under his chin or the reason he kept his phone face down on the table. She did not ask. Mystery increases the surface area of a person. She ran her hands around the edges and measured nothing out loud. At home, Adrian was diligent tenderness, oil changes and breakfast bowls, his hand at the small of her back when the grocery aisle narrowed. He noticed new shelves, he did not notice new silences. He kissed her hairline the way one blesses an idol. He had forgotten how to ask questions without answers built into them. "How was class?" he'd ask, and she'd say, "Good," and they both pretended that was fluent. Marriage is a language. If you don't practice, you end up speaking only in phrases you learned years ago, charming but unfit for emergency. When the center asked Myra to plan a public reading for the end of term, she hesitated and said yes. She arranged chairs, printed programs, chose a bowl large enough for compliments. She ordered string lights because they had always made difficult truths feel slightly more permissible. The night of the reading, the town arrived with warm coats over wrinkled dresses, hands smelling of laundry soap and nerves. Levi wore a black shirt that made him look like a stagehand, like the person who knew where all the ropes were tied. Halfway through the lineup, a woman read a paragraph about learning to breathe again after her husband died at 43, and the room ripened into a hush so complete you could hear the page numbers turning in people's pockets. When applause finally returned, Levi leaned in from his chair against the wall and said, "Just for Myra, I didn't know silence could be loud enough to be a bridge." She didn't look at him. She didn't have to. A bridge can be felt before it's seen. After, amid paper cups and crumbs and people saying, "I never thought I'd be brave enough," Levi handed Myra a folded piece of notebook paper. "For when the lights are down," he said. She could have refused it. She could have handed it back with a smile that says we are grown, sensible, bound to our better selves by buttons and vows. Instead, she slid it into the pocket of her cardigan next to the clip that always snapped at the wrong moment. She read the note at home on the stairs with her shoes still on, one hand on the banister like she might need to steady herself. It was short. "I think you carry a door around in your chest. I think you hold it closed for other people's comfort. If you ever need someone to hold the hallway while you open it, I'm here." There were no demands in the words, only an offering so clean it hurt. She folded the paper and put it in a cookbook no one opened anymore. Days braided themselves into weeks. Myra became a woman with an extra heartbeat. She saw it in reflective surfaces, the way one sees a flash of a bird and cannot unknow the sky has been altered. She wrote more, longhand, late at night, sometimes leaving ink on the pillowcase when sleep ambushed her mid-sentence. Her words sharpened into a blade she kept wrapped in velvet. She started to hum again while rinsing plates. Even the house seemed to notice. The heron's crack line caught the afternoon light like a vein. They didn't touch. They didn't have to. It is astonishing how much trespass a glance can carry. Still, lines exist to be negotiated. One evening, after class, as Myra locked the supply closet, the fluorescent light fizzed and died with a finality that felt theatrical. In the dark hallway, her hand found his forearm because the human body is loyal to instinct long before it remembers ethics. He stood very still. When the emergency light stuttered alive, she let go as if she'd burned herself on a memory. "Coffee?" he asked, and the word was so plain it could have been a rescue or a dare. She thought of Adrian already home, stirring a pot, waiting with patience that used to feel like a gift. She thought of the footbridge, the counting of breaths. "No," she said, and then, because the truth required an equal and opposite weight, "Not tonight." She drove the long way home, past the playing fields where floodlights made everything look possible. She parked at the overlook where teenagers came to practice the physics of their future. She sat with the engine off until the cold asked pointed questions of her bones. When she finally walked in the door, Adrian was on the couch with a blanket and a documentary about coral reefs narrated by a British voice that implied hope was measured in Latin names. He patted the cushion beside him, a gesture that meant love and a request for quiet. She sat and rested her head on his shoulder and thought of tide pools and patience and the symbiosis of tiny creatures doing impossible things together until something bigger roared through and changed all the math. The next afternoon, she slipped into the feather before opening time. The owner, Talia, was mopping, her gray hair braided like a story that kept adding chapters. "You're early," Talia said, but kindness turned the statement into an invitation. Myra perched at the bar while Talia arranged lemons like small suns. "He's in the back, fixing the ice machine that gives up the ghost every third Thursday," Talia said without being asked. He's good with stubborn things. Myra could have left then, taken the hint life had offered in soft lighting. Instead, she waited. Levi emerged with damp sleeves and a grin that made her understand why sailors used to blame the sea for their choices. "I'm not staying," she said, which was a category error from the start. They talked for 20 minutes about winter oranges, the ethics of memoir, the usefulness of names. He told her he'd stopped going to the footbridge because he was tired of pretending not to look down. "I want to look," he said. "I want to see the water for what it is and what it can do." She didn't kiss him, he didn't reach for her. But when she stood to leave, he said her name in a way that arranged the alphabet into a promise. She drove home with hands at 10 and 2 like a student driver, every traffic light a sermon about restraint. That night, she lay awake beside Adrian and made a list in the dark of everything she would lose and everything she already had. She realized lists do not save anyone. Only choices do, and the choosing is rarely clean. The following week, the class voted to end the term at the footbridge Levi had written about, to read there, to let the creek earn their words. "We'll bring thermoses and blankets," someone said, and everyone pretended not to notice the tremor in Myra's hands. The day came cold and clear. The bridge was narrower than she had pictured, old wood with iron bolts like knuckles. The creek sang the only song it knew. They read. A cyclist rang a bell as he passed, leaving behind a signature of tin. When the others wandered off toward coffee, Myra stayed. Levi stayed. The last of the group waved and said, "Lock up the bridge when you're done," and everyone laughed because rituals matter even when they're jokes. The sky leaned down. Levi said, "I keep thinking about your door. I don't want to push it, but I'm here, halfway down the hall." She turned to the water and watched it write its own name on stone after stone. "I don't know how to do this without breaking something that doesn't deserve it," she said. The creek answered in vowels. He stepped closer but not close enough to shorten the sentence between them. "Maybe breaking isn't the only thing that happens," he said. "Maybe some doors open like windows, and sometimes the glass was already cracked." She didn't know if that was mercy or poetry or both. She did know the plank beneath her right foot creaked in a way that predicted weather. She counted her breaths, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then she lifted her head and said the truest thing she had in her. "I don't want to be saved. I want to be seen." He nodded, as if he'd been waiting for the sentence to arrive for years, and said, "Then let's look at you." The wind braided their hair, and a stray leaf landed on the railing like punctuation. She didn't take it as a sign. She took it as a leaf. And yet, a sign snuck in anyway, because as they stood there, a hawk unstitched the sky above them in one clean line, and she felt, for the first time in years, the sensation of being precisely where she stood. Summer heat arrived without grammar, all run-on and breathless. The town learned to move slower, to carry shade like a second language. The feather filled with travelers who read maps like horoscopes and asked which way to the waterfall with their mouths already open for wonder. Myra reduced her class to a workshop in the mornings, then took long afternoons to write at the library, where the air conditioning made her joints sing in gratitude. Her notebook bloomed with sentences that frightened and nourished her in equal measure. She had not told Adrian about any of it, not the door in her chest, not the footbridge, not Levi's note folded to fit a life. She had also not kissed Levi, not stepped over any threshold she couldn't step back from. This made her feel both virtuous and dishonest, a combination that tasted like metal. Adrian remained kindness swaddled in habit. He bought peaches that ripened in the bowl like time-lapse miracles. He asked what she needed for the workshop, and then nodded, satisfied, when she said just markers. One late afternoon, the library's power hiccuped, and the lights went out with the gentle drama of a theater dimming for Act Two. Myra gathered her things and walked into the syrupy heat. At the corner, Levi waited in a patch of shade made generous by a maple. He lifted a hand, not a wave, exactly a query. "You look like you could use cold water," he said. She did. They walked to the little grocery that smelled like melon and cardboard and the history of small talk. They drank from bottles leaning against the freezer door, the cold climbing their hands like vines. "Tell me something unflattering," he said, and she laughed because there were so many things that would have qualified. "I hoard pens," she said. "I judge people for misquoting poets and then misquote them myself when I'm tired. I sometimes pretend to like the music Adrian plays because it minimizes the space between us." The last confession hung in the air like laundry. He nodded as if tallying his own crimes. "I confuse intensity for intimacy. I have left good people because I liked how the door sounded when it shut. I don't want to be that man anymore. She watched a fly trace the rim of a bin of cherries. What do you want to be? She asked. He took a breath that seemed to consult a committee. Responsible to the truth. The sentence landed in her like a key she hadn't let herself imagine. They walked to the park. Children squealed from sprinklers, parents negotiated bedtime with popsicles. They sat on a bench that groaned like an elder. He reached for her hand. She didn't move away. The contact was an electric confession, and yet nothing cracked. The world continued issuing instructions to birds. She felt how simple a complicated thing could be, and the simplicity scared her more than any sin. That evening, she told Adrian she wanted to take a weekend at the retreat center by the lake to finish a project with her class. It was not a lie, though it was not the whole truth either. He looked pleased the way a person looks when a plant they've overwatered finally blooms in spite of them. "You've been so alive lately," he said, and the word lodged like a seed in a place she had not known was soil. She kissed his cheek and packed a bag with books, a sweater, and the version of herself that could balance on the line between patience and trespass without falling off. The retreat center smelled like damp wood and discipline. The lake lay flat as an oath. Her students took cabins and promised one another to write without flinching. That first night, a thunderstorm marched across the water in boots. She stood on the screened porch and counted the seconds between flash and sound until the storm walked past, leaving the trees gossiping about what they had seen. Levi arrived the next morning as a guest reader, invited last minute when another writer canceled, a coincidence that felt like either generosity or orchestration. He wore a white shirt the color of possibility. When he read on the wide porch, his voice gathered the room like a net gathers fish, gently, efficiently, inevitably. He read about repair. He read about how some hurts require stitches and some require a season. He did not look at her, which felt like the greatest respect he could offer. That afternoon, the group hiked the lake trail in a crooked line. At the overlook, the path narrowed around a boulder that wore initials like armor. Myra stopped and pressed her palm to the stone. Heat traveled into her. "Your door," Levi said quietly behind her. "It's not a secret passage. It's the front entrance to your own house." She turned. And because the only constant in stories is that what is avoided finds a way to arrive, Adrian stood 20 feet away on the path, wearing the expression of a man who has realized his map is wrong. He had driven up unannounced with a bag of snacks because he thought it would be fun to surprise you. The word fun hollowed itself out and echoed. He took in the tableau Myra, hand on rock, Levi too near to be neutral. A group of students pretending to see birds in the trees. Adrian walked closer and did the thing he always did when something didn't fit. He organized it in his mind, label maker neat. "Hi," he said to Levi, handing him a name and a handshake both. "I've heard about your writing." Levi met it with a quiet that did not apologize. "It's good to meet you," he said, and the sentence accepted nothing it did not contain. Myra's body buzzed like she'd swallowed a hive. She wanted to run. She wanted to kneel on the path and tell the ground thank you for not opening. "We should talk," Adrian said to her later, when the hike wound down and the day had the guilty color of a bruise. "Yes," she said, and the word was an honest debt. They sat on the cabin's narrow porch, feet on a woven mat that had weathered other people's truths. Cicadas tuned themselves. Adrian placed the bag of snacks between them like tribute. "Do you want him?" he asked, and she loved him for saying it so directly, for not hiding inside smaller accusations. She took the long way to the answer. "I want to know myself," she said. "He has been a mirror. But mirrors don't make the face. They only reveal what's already there." He nodded slowly, the kind of nod that earns men a reputation for wisdom. "Do you want me?" he asked, and the sentence showed its soft underbelly. She thought of the young man at the bus stop with a poem in his pocket. She thought of the steady hand on her back in the aisle. She thought of every night she had turned her face to the wall and pretended to sleep, because the alternative was to admit they were lost inside the same room. "I want you," she said, "and I want a life that feels like both of us are awake in it." Adrian exhaled. "Then we have work to do," he said, and she knew he meant therapy and clearing drawers and the dangerous tenderness of real questions. "And what about him?" he asked. The cicadas sent up a chorus like a referee's whistle held too long. "He is not a villain," she said. "Neither am I." The words were the bravest map she could draw. They sat until the porch light attracted moths and the night wore itself thin. Later, she found Levi by the dock, shoes off, feet in the kind of water that made ankles ring like bells. He asked if I wanted you, she said. What did you say? Levi asked, not making it easier by offering the answer he might have wanted. I said I want to know myself, she said. He looked out over the lake. That's the only answer that isn't a lie, he said. What do you want from me? She considered the moon's shredded reflection. Patience, she said, and distance. He nodded. Both are a kind of love, he said, and for a second she believed him. They chose therapy with the same earnest anxiety with which they had chosen a crib years ago, reading reviews, asking friends in whispers, hoping for a person who could rearrange furniture in their minds without breaking heirlooms. The therapist had a plant she never named and a bowl of smooth stones stamped with words like listen and risk. When asked to pick one, Myra chose risk because the word was already in her mouth. Adrian chose listen, and Myra felt a ledger inside her balance by a single coin. In the beginning, sessions felt like working a muscle gone to sleep, prickly, humiliating, dumbly hopeful. They learned to turn questions inside out. Instead of, why don't you ask me about my day? Myra tried. It makes me feel invisible when I speak into the room and don't hear a response. Instead of, why are you distant? Adrian tried. I am afraid I have become better at tasks than tenderness. They practiced until honesty stopped tasting like metal and started tasting like rain. They established embargoes. No big conversations after 10 p.m., no phones in bed, no assuming the other was a mind reader. They created rituals. A Thursday night walk even in bad weather. A Sunday morning, 2 truths and 1 question. A silly rule that whoever found the ceramic heron facing the wrong way had to tell a story from a year they never talk about. The heron, once a sentinel, became a trickster, forcing them to unearth the good gossip of their own lives. Myra wrote more, but now the compass pointed inward, not toward the myth of rescue. She told her students she had been practicing being a person who disappoints people honestly instead of pleasing them dishonestly. Some nodded as if she had given them permission to breathe in public. The community center felt less like a refuge and more like a workplace, the good kind, where labor results in food. She saw Levi sometimes. He came to a reading, he left early. He sent an email with a link to a poem about a river that refuses to be straight. He did not ask for anything. She did not offer anything. They learned a new kind of distance that wasn't punitive but purposeful. One evening, months into the new architecture, they hosted dinner for friends. Laughter threaded through the house like a garland, trying not to be sentimental. Someone leaned too hard on the mantel, and the ceramic heron toppled and shattered into blue punctuation marks on the floor. The room froze the way rooms do when they are afraid of how a woman will react. Myra knelt and picked up a piece that held the heron's eye. He's been trying to fly for years, she said, and everyone exhaled in a key of relief that made the window fog. Later, after the mess was swept and wine replaced apologies, she glued the pieces tenderly but left a gap along the wing on purpose. On their Thursday walk, they reached the footbridge at dusk. The creek wore twilight like a scarf. Fireflies practiced Morse code in the weeds. Adrian stopped at the middle and rested his hands on the rail. I used to think commitment meant never wanting anything else, he said. Now I think it means choosing this, even when wanting is louder. He turned to her with a face newly unfamiliar and newly dear. Do you still choose this? She looked at him and imagined a life in which their questions stayed this sharp. Yes, she said, and I choose it knowing I am capable of wanting more than one thing. I will tell you when the wanting gets loud. We will stand on the bridge and listen together. They kissed there, a kiss that wasn't a monument but a milestone. Quiet, certain, a brass marker bolted into wood to say. Someone passed here and kept going. She felt the old choreography of their bodies and the new step they'd learned. Pause, ask, answer, proceed. It wasn't dramatic. It felt like competence. Sometimes competence is the most romantic thing in the world. That night, her phone lit up with a message from Levi. Saw a hawk. Thought of the day at the bridge. Proud of you. She stared at the screen until the words softened, then typed. Thank you for the hallway. Doors open, different direction. Be well. She turned the phone face down and didn't feel like she was hiding. She felt like she was placing a book back on a shelf after finishing it, grateful, changed, ready for the next one. Autumn laid itself over the town like a quilt sewn by decisive hands. The park filled with the sugar smell of rotting leaves. The Feather hosted a reading series called Small Salvations, and Myra read an essay about the ethics of doors. How some open outward in case of fire, how some lock from the inside for safety, how some must be replaced, not repaired. After, an older woman with a compass tattoo on her wrist took Myra's hand and said, "I thought I was the only one who needed a hallway." They laughed the way people laugh when they recognize a map. At home, the mantel was bare except for the newly imperfect heron and a Polaroid of Myra and Adrian at the river. Hair messy, eyes clear. They had made new laughter, the unphotogenic kind that counts more because it refuses to pose. They still fought, sometimes with the old sharpness, sometimes with the new softness that bruises then heals. They were not a miracle, they were a practice. On winter's first morning, Myra woke early and wrote a letter to the woman she had been the night the river rose. The letter did not beg forgiveness and did not offer excuses. It said, "You will be tempted to mistake a mirror for a door. You will be tempted to hand your fear to someone who looks like courage. Keep your courage, share your fear. Choose the bridge that asks you to count out loud." She folded the letter and slid it into the cookbook with the note Levi had given her months before. Then she took both out and placed them in a shoebox labeled tools. At breakfast, Adrian read the weather and mispronounced a town name and pretended not to hear her gentle correction until she repeated it. And then they both laughed at the choreography of 20 years learning a new song. She reached for his hand across the table. His fingers intertwined with hers with the authority of muscle memory and the curiosity of beginners. It felt like a bridge. It felt like risk. It felt like listening. Myra exhaled, long and clean and somewhere in the house, the glue on the heron set. Long and clean and somewhere in the house, the glue on the heron set.